Welcome to the Crain's New York Business and Future of Infrastructure webcast. My name is Christine Honey-Dare-Bryan, and I'm an assistant managing editor with Crain's. Today, we're talking about the future of New York's infrastructure, and we have an incredible panel of experts here today. John, let's turn to what you're seeing your members go through. They've really been hit hard, and what, in terms of this funding, should we know? What has been taking up your time with kind of stressing about how important this funding is?
Well, first of all, our whole political operation in Washington has been geared toward transport sector funding, not only the MTA, but the airline industry and the railroad industry. Everything that moves, we've been advocating for funding. And I think Pat and Tom both touched on it. This whole idea of operating budget shortfalls and operating versus capital. And the truth of the matter is, as I think was spoken about, that the system fell into a state of disrepair, and not only because of capital disinvestment, but definitely a significant portion of the disrepair was due to previous disinvestment in capital, but also because of operating budget shortfalls. And when there's a shortfall in the operating budget, the company has historically done a couple of things. They've deferred maintenance, they've slashed service, they've done all the things that made the system less palatable for riders. And I don't think that's anybody's desire to do at this point. So I don't think it's Pat's desire or certainly anybody else in the MTA. And it sort of points to the greater importance of the operating budget right now. And the operating budget has fallen victim to different revenue sources that are very volatile, that are reliant on the economy or reliant on the fare box. We now see what the result is of an over-reliance on the fare box. The ridership decreased by 90%, and because there's such a massive reliance on the fare box in New York, which one would think is a very good thing, it has led to a huge decline in revenue for the MTA. And so the federal money becomes super important as a bridge. That word was used. It's a good word, as a bridge to the future. But that bridge to the future has to be met with a new sustainable revenue source that's not so reliant on or not so susceptible to economic turbulence and to the fare box. And whatever that source is, it needs to start being discussed now, because there's not going to be continued federal bailouts. It's not going to happen every 6 months or every 9 months. But what is going to happen is riders will eventually come back. And if there's an operating budget crunch, that's a massive disincentive to do exactly what we need, which are the riders to come back into the New York City subway. So just in terms of our workforce, we have 3,000 or so TWU Local 100 members that are reimbursed to the capital budget, but the overwhelming majority of our workforce is the operation and maintenance of the system. And again, that day-to-day operation of the system and maintenance of the system is reliant on state of good repair, and state of good repair can't be achieved unless there's, at the same moment in time, capital investment and day-to-day operating money, so that we can keep the system in a day-to-day state of good repair, as well as take care of the long-term investment that sort of sustains us over a longer period of time.
John, now let's turn to transit workers. What does it look like for the workers who are out there, and as service picks up, what do you see?
Well, the first thing, and Pat touched on it, that it's nearly 9,000 transit workers that have come back from either isolation or illness. And in our view, hazard pay is absolutely warranted for New York City transit workers and for all MTA workers, and for that matter, all essential workers. But in our particular case, almost 9,000 of us came back into the fray, back into the face of the pandemic after being isolated due to exposure. And the greatest incentive to have transit workers return into this calamity is to pay hazard pay. And it's good for us to hear niceties either from Pat or from Secretary Elaine Chao, who gave a big thank you to transit workers. But the best way to respect us is to actually put money in the wallets of transit workers and give that kind of monetary respect for the risk that we've taken. And so in addition to hazard pay, Pat touched on a few of the items, and I think in a positive way. The many things that are going on right now as a result of the pandemic need to be enshrined permanently. Certainly the mass decontamination of the system, routine, consistent mass decontamination of rolling stock buses, but also of workplaces. And right now that's not really happening to the extent that it is on rolling stock and buses. Secondly, we now have several hundred buses that are going to have plastic shields, plastic protection against exposure for the bus operators. That must be expanded expanded to the entire fleet, and it must be enshrined permanently, not just during the pandemic. And that goes hand in hand with rear door boarding. These things are a must. Bus operators were protected by through social distancing with a piece of yellow tape, and in many cases still are. And that does not stop a hack or a sneeze from 13 feet away or 14 feet away from making it up to the bus operator, or from getting on another rider, and that eventually makes its way up to the operator. So that's another instance of something that must be enshrined permanently. We need shields for the conductors. We need social distancing on train platforms at the conductor's station. Too often in this crazy, psychotic world that pre-existed the pandemic, conductors get spat upon for no reason at all by a frustrated rider. So there has to be some form of workplace protection, and that begins with social distancing on the platform for conductors, even though they are wearing face shields now. Also, the homelessness crisis in New York City, which is not the fault of the MTA. In fact, it's an epic failure on the part of New York City and Mayor de Blasio. It's an epic failure that's been brought into extreme clarity by the pandemic, as the amount of train and bus service that was put out shrank in large part to allow for decompression in the workforce. The amount of homelessness, the amount of homeless concentrated on the trains because there were less trains out. So this did not happen because of the pandemic, but the glaring societal failure of it became very obvious to everybody in the midst of the pandemic. So less trains combined with homeless folks not wanting to use New York City social services, no trust in New York City social services, so they flocked into the trains and created and sort of made worse an already very bad situation. And so the humane removal of the homeless from this subway system and this bus system has to continue after this pandemic abates. It's a must. Also, social distancing is the name of the game. Everybody's talking about social distancing. There has to be an expert panel that includes organized labor in a discussion about what social distancing looks like in the workplaces, but also in the system. And I've heard Sarah Feinberg speak, I think, very truthfully about the difficulties of achieving a level of social distancing in the subway. And right now, with ridership having been in steep decline, it's still difficult to maintain social distancing on trains and buses. So we need to figure that out, and that's going to take a lot of heads around the table and a lot of serious discussion about how we move forward.
Pat, let me make sure you have the chance to respond to any of those points, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers would, want to hear from you.
No, look, I agree with what John has said, including on the hazard pay point. I joined Governor Cuomo in his support for federally funded hazard pay for John's members, other first responders, and essential employees. Something like that was appropriately done after 9/11. It ought to be included here as well.
Lisa,
we don't view it as the role of the federal government only. We work directly for the MTA and the state of New York, and we view hazard pay as a moral obligation of the employer. If there's a federal bill that includes hazard pay and the MTA gets reimbursed for it, that's all the better. But if the federal government rejects this congressional bill that includes hazard pay, then the obligation falls upon the MTA.
Well, John, I think the federal government has a moral responsibility to do this. Whether that means something in Washington these days, I don't know. I will note that right now the federal government is paying our operating expenses, and the first 3.9 is going to go with our operating expenses. I've asked for 3.9 in addition to pay the bills, the electric bill, payroll, et cetera. I think that the right and moral and economically appropriate thing for the MTA and the city and state of New York to do is for the federal government to fund it. And I think that ought to be our mutual goal.
Yeah, it is. But if they fail, we're coming looking for you.
John, I understand.